Red and blue lights didn't just illuminate the damp asphalt. They violently sliced through the night mist. David smelled stale coffee and rain before he heard heavy boots crunching toward his rear bumper. He wasn't a hero tonight. He was just a tired man waiting for the inevitable. Fluorescent lights buzzed with a dying, erratic hum above pump number 4. David stood perfectly still, watching the digital numbers on the gas meter tick upward with agonizing slowness. It was 2:14 a.m. The air smelled of spilled, unleaded wet concrete and the overwhelming scent of cheap burnt coffee wafting from his paper cup. His lower back throbbed a dull, rhythmic ache born from 14 straight hours of standing on concrete floors in a poorly ventilated convention center. He wore a faded charcoal grey hoodie with a frayed drawstring, loose denim jeans and sneakers that had seen better years. He looked like anybody else trying to exist in the liminal space of a Tuesday night. Tires hissed against the wet pavement behind him. David didn't turn immediately. He took a sip of the bitter liquid, letting it burn his tongue. He heard the sudden sharp chirp of a police siren, just a half-second burst enough to demand attention, without waking the entire zip code. Then came the blinding flood of the cruiser's takedown lights, washing over David's shoulders and throwing his elongated, distorted shadow across his scratched sedan. He closed his eyes. For a fraction of a second, his chest tightened. It wasn't panic. It was a suffocating leaden fatigue. He knew the script. He knew the choreography of this particular dance, and he was simply too exhausted to perform it. "Step away from the vehicle. Keep your hands where I can see them." The voice over the PA system was clipped, nasal, and dripping with an unearned authority. David placed the coffee cup on the roof of his car. The cardboard bottom was already damp, leaving a ring on the metal. He turned around slowly. The glare from the cruiser's spotlight was a physical pressure against his retinas. He squinted, bringing his hands up to chest level. Not quite a surrender, just an acknowledgement. His palms were open, fingers loose. A car door slammed. The sound echoed off the metal canopy above. Footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate. "I said step away from the vehicle. Are you deaf?" "I'm stepping away," David said, his voice flat, devoid of the deference the officer was clearly hunting for. He took 2 steps to his left, distancing himself from the gas nozzle still resting in his tank. Officer Thomas Foley moved into the periphery of the blinding white light. He was a stocky man, maybe late 20s, his uniform stretched tight across a barrel chest. His hand rested casually, yet entirely intentionally, on the butt of his service weapon. The leather of his duty belt creaked with every shift of his weight. Behind him, a second officer, taller, thinner, looking vaguely uncomfortable, hung back near the cruiser's fender. "What are you doing here?" Foley asked, stopping a solid 6 feet away. His chin tilted up, a posture meant to intimidate. "Pumping gas," David said. He nodded toward the hose. "Buying coffee." "At 2 in the morning. Cars run out of gas at 2 in the morning." David kept his hands visible. The cold night air was biting through his thin hoodie, raising goosebumps on his forearms. He felt a sharp prickle of irritation at the base of his neck. He wanted to sleep. He wanted to take off his shoes. He did not want to play this game. "Whose vehicle is this?" Foley took a step closer. The smell of the officer reached David now, a mixture of harsh mint, chewing gum, damp wool from his uniform shirt, and the sharp metallic scent of adrenaline. Foley was looking for a fight. He was scanning David's baggy clothes, his dark skin, his tired eyes, and calculating a threat that didn't exist. "Mine," David replied. "It's registered to me. You got ID on you, in my back right pocket. I didn't ask where it was, I asked if you had it." Foley's jaw clenched. The lack of fear in David's eyes was clearly unnerving him. Cops like Foley relied on nervous energy. They fed on the stuttered apologies and frantic compliance of people terrified of a badge. David was giving him nothing but a blank, exhausted wall. "Yes, I have ID." David shifted his weight, slightly easing the pressure off his left knee, which had been locking up since noon. Foley's hand tightened on his holster. "Keep your hands up. Turn around. Place your hands flat on the trunk of the car." David exhaled a slow, rattling breath through his nose. He could end this. He could say the words. He could announce his job, pull his credentials, and watch this puffed-up patrolman shrink into a puddle of apologies. But a dark, stubborn knot tightened in his gut. A part of him, the deeply human, raw, resentful part, wanted to see exactly how far Foley would take this. He thought of his younger brother who drove a similar beat-up sedan and wore similar faded hoodies. His brother didn't have a magic shield in his pocket. "Am I being detained?" David asked, his tone dropping an octave. "You're being investigated for suspicious activity," Foley snapped. "Now turn around and put your hands on the trunk before I put you on the concrete." The younger cop near the cruiser shifted his weight. "Tom," he muttered a quiet note of caution. "Stay out of it." "Hayes," Foley barked without looking back. David turned. He felt the cold, damp metal of the trunk under his palms, the grit of highway dirt pressed into his skin. He spread his legs slightly, assuming the position with a fluid, practiced ease that seemed to momentarily confuse the officer behind him. "Do you have any weapons on you?" Foley asked, stepping in close. The heat radiating off the cop's body was suffocating. "Anything sharp that's going to stick me?" "No weapons, no sharps," David said to the metal trunk. He felt the heavy, intrusive sweep of Foley's hands traveling down his sides, checking his waistline, patting down the loose fabric of his jeans. The humiliation of it was a bitter metallic taste in the back of his throat. It was a violation so casual, so routine, that the sheer mundanity of it made David's blood run hot. Foley's rough hands moved over David's pockets, unearthing nothing but a set of house keys and a pack of gum. The officer's frustration was palpable. It vibrated through his fingertips. He shoved his hand against David's spine, pressing him harder against the cold metal of the trunk. "I asked for your ID." Foley grunted his breath, hot and minty, against the back of David's neck. "You said it was in your pocket." "Back right," David replied, his cheek resting inches from the wet, dirty glass of his rear window. "You're patting my left leg." Foley let out a sharp breath, yanking his hand up to David's right pocket. He dug his thick fingers into the denim, pulling out the worn black leather wallet. He stepped back, the sound of his boots scraping against the asphalt. The oppressive pressure on David's spine vanished, replaced by the biting wind. "Keep your hands on the car," Foley ordered. David didn't move. He listened. He heard the satisfying thwack of the wallet opening. He listened to the ambient noise of the gas station, the rhythmic clicking of the pump finally slowing down the distant hum of a semi-truck on the interstate, the steady drizzle hitting the metal canopy. Foley was looking for a standard driver's license. He was looking for an excuse to run a name, find an unpaid parking ticket, a busted taillight, anything to justify the adrenaline spiking in his veins. Instead, Foley's fingers brushed against something heavy, something metallic. David heard the rustle of the leather. Then absolute silence. The silence dragged on for 3 full seconds. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet, broken only by the hiss of the rain. David didn't need to turn around to know what was happening. He knew the layout of his own wallet. The driver's license was tucked behind a flap. Taking up the entire right side, impossible to miss, was a solid gold 5-pointed star encased in a circle, deeply engraved with the words, "United States Secret Service." Below it, the crisp, rigid identification card bearing David's face, his name and the federal seal. "What?" Foley's voice cracked. It was a microscopic fracture in his bravado. but in the quiet of the night it sounded like a gunshot. David slowly peeled his hands off the wet trunk. He didn't ask for permission. He turned around, his movements deliberate and unhurried. The transformation in Officer Foley was violent in its suddenness. The aggressive chest-out posture had completely collapsed. The heavy, flushed color in his cheeks had vanished, draining away to leave his skin a pasty, sickly grey under the harsh fluorescent lights. His mouth hung slightly open, a thin string of saliva connecting his lips. He was staring at the open wallet in his hands, as if it were a live grenade, whose pin he had just absent-mindedly pulled. "Problem, officer?" David asked. His voice wasn't triumphant. It wasn't loud. It was exhausted, hollow, and laced with a quiet, devastating anger. Foley swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed convulsively. His eyes darted from the gold badge to David's face, then back to the badge. The mental gears were grinding, visibly stripping themselves, as he tried to reconcile the tired black man in the frayed hoodie with the federal authority resting in his palms. To assault a federal agent, to unlawfully detain one, to lay hands on one without cause, wasn't just a reprimand. It was a career-ending felony. Foley started. He licked his lips. They were bone dry. "You're David Carter," David said, pointing a finger at the ID card. "Special Agent, Protective Intelligence Division, and you are illegally detaining me, Officer Foley." The younger cop, Hayes, who had been hanging back by the cruiser, finally caught the shift in the atmosphere. He took a few tentative steps forward, his hand resting on his radio. "Tom, everything okay?" Foley didn't look at his partner. He couldn't tear his eyes away from David. His hands were actually trembling. A fine tremor shook the leather of the wallet, making the gold star catch the harsh overhead light. "Agent Carter," Foley managed to choke out. His voice was entirely different now, higher, thinner, stripped of all bass. "I didn't realize. You didn't announce yourself." "I was buying coffee," David said, his eyes narrowing. He took a slow step forward. Foley instinctively took a step back, a glaring reversal of power that made David's stomach turn. "You asked what I was doing. I told you. You asked whose car this was. I told you. At what point during pumping, unleaded gas, was I required to present federal credentials to a municipal patrolman? You fit a description." Foley stammered the oldest, weakest excuse, tumbling from his mouth like a reflex. Sweat was beginning to bead along his hairline. "We had a call about a suspicious individual in the area. Checking door handles." "In a car?" David asked softly. "I was checking door handles while driving a registered vehicle into a brightly lit gas station." Foley looked down at the asphalt. He was drowning, and he knew it. He held the wallet out his arm, stiff and awkward. "Here, sir. My apologies. Just a misunderstanding." David didn't take the wallet immediately. He let Foley stand there, arm extended, the heavy silence, punishing the cop more than words ever could. David looked at Foley's trembling fingers. He felt a brief, dark surge of satisfaction, but it washed away instantly, leaving behind a profound, sickening emptiness. This wasn't a victory. If he were just David the civilian, just David the tired guy in the hoodie, his cheek would still be pressed against the glass. He might be in handcuffs by now. He might be bleeding. David reached out and snatched the wallet from Foley's grip. He didn't say a word. He snapped it shut, the sound sharp as a whip crack, and shoved it back into his pocket. "We're done here," David said. He turned his back on the officer, a deliberate display of dismissal. He walked over to the gas pump, pulled the nozzle from his car, and returned it to the cradle. The machine beeped a cheerful electronic sound that felt horribly out of place. Foley stood frozen. Hayes had finally walked up, catching a glimpse of the situation. The younger cop's eyes widened in horror, looking from his partner to David. "Let's go," Foley whispered to Hayes, his voice barely audible over the rain. He practically jogged back to the cruiser, climbing into the driver's seat with frantic, clumsy movements. David picked up his damp coffee cup from the roof of his car. He didn't watch them pull away. He just stood under the flickering canopy, the bitter taste of the coffee, and the night heavy on his tongue, feeling more exhausted than he had in his entire life. Water pooled against the rubber floor mats of the sedan, slowly soaking into the frayed edges of David's sneakers. He sat behind the steering wheel, the engine idling with a rough, uneven sputter that he had been meaning to get looked at for 3 months. The heater blasted dry, stale air directly into his face, smelling faintly of burnt dust and old cabin filters. He didn't reach to put the car in gear. He just sat there, staring through the windshield as the rain distorted the harsh, fluorescent lights of the gas station canopy into blurry, bleeding halos. His hands were shaking. It wasn't a violent tremor, just a fine, high-frequency vibration running through his fingers and up his forearms. He gripped the steering wheel, squeezing the cracked faux leather until his knuckles turned ashen, trying to force the stillness back into his muscles. It didn't work. The adrenaline, which had been utterly absent during the actual confrontation, was now dumping into his bloodstream in a toxic, delayed tidal wave. His heart hammered against his ribs, a heavy, erratic thud that made him nauseous. He had handled it perfectly. He had been cool, detached, and authoritative. He had won. So why did he feel like he had just survived a car crash? David closed his eyes and leaned his head against the headrest. The leather was cold. He played the tape backward in his mind, analyzing the encounter with the brutal, clinical detachment his instructors at Glencoe had drilled into him. Foley's initial approach, the angle of the cop's body, the hand resting on the weapon, the complete lack of de-escalation tactics. It was a textbook example of predatory policing a hunter, looking for an easy kill in a poorly lit hunting ground, and David had played the prey. Willingly. That was the splinter in his mind, the sharp edge of shame that was currently tearing at his gut. He could have ended it the second Foley walked up. A simple, "I'm a federal agent, my credentials are in my pocket." But he hadn't. He had let the dance play out. He had wanted to feel the edge of the blade to confirm the ugly reality he already knew to be true. He had wanted to prove a point to a man who didn't care about points-only compliance. It was a stupid, reckless impulse. If his detail leader, a rigid by-the-book guy named Harrison, ever found out he had allowed a municipal patrolman to physically lay hands on him without immediately identifying himself, David would be riding a desk in a windowless sub-basement until his retirement. He reached over and grabbed the coffee cup from the passenger seat. The liquid was tepid now, an acidic sludge that tasted of burnt grounds and cardboard. He forced himself to swallow a mouthful, using the harsh bitterness to ground himself. His cell phone buzzed in the center console. The screen lit up, casting a pale, bluish glow over the dashboard. It was a text from Kevin, his younger brother. "You up need help with this resume garbage." David stared at the notification. Kevin was 23, navigating the brutal entry-level job market with a mixture of naive optimism and growing resentment. Kevin drove a 2012 Honda Civic that burned oil and had a permanently busted taillight. Kevin wore hoodies and baggy jeans because they were comfortable. Kevin didn't have a gold star in his wallet to act as a bulletproof vest. If Kevin had been standing at pump number 4 tonight, how would the script have ended? Foley wouldn't have turned pale. Foley wouldn't have stammered an apology. Foley would have found his reason to escalate. A wrong word, a flinch. A perfectly natural display of frustration that was all it took to turn a minor traffic stop into a hashtag. A hot, acidic wave of anger washed over David so intense it made his eyes water. It was a localized, impotent fury directed at Foley, at the system, and overwhelmingly at himself. His badge was a free pass, a golden ticket out of the reality his own brother lived in every single day. He wore the armor, but it only protected the man holding the credentials, not the skin underneath. He put the car in drive. The transmission clunked heavily. He pulled out of the gas station, his tires slipping slightly on the slick pavement before catching traction. The drive back to his apartment was a blur of neon signs reflecting off wet blacktop and the rhythmic hypnotic sweeping of his windshield wipers. He drove with mechanical precision, his mind completely divorced from the physical act of operating the vehicle. He navigated the grid of the city, avoiding the main arteries where patrol cruisers like to run radar. He wasn't speeding, but the sight of a Crown Victoria, or an Explorer, sitting in a dark median would make his chest tight. A Pavlovian response he couldn't shake off despite the heavy embossed leather wallet sitting securely in his back pocket. He arrived at his apartment complex, a nondescript brick monolith built in the late 80s that smelled perpetually of damp carpet and stale cooking oil. He parked in his assigned spot, killing the engine. The silence that filled the cabin was immediate and oppressive. Before getting out, David opened the center console. Inside, bolted to the chassis of the car, was a small biometric steel lockbox. He pressed his thumb against the scanner. It chirped, a tiny green light flashing before the lid popped open with a heavy click. Resting inside on a bed of dark foam was his government-issued Sig Sauer P229. The black steel was cold and completely indifferent. He had told Foley he had no weapons. It had been a calculated lie. If he had admitted to having a firearm, even an unloaded one in a lockbox, Foley's adrenaline would have spiked into the red zone. The pat-down would have turned into a felony stop. David would have been face down on the wet asphalt, with a knee in his back, before he could even attempt to explain he was an 1811. He stared at the weapon. It was a tool of his trade, a lethal instrument he was authorized to use in defense of the nation's highest-ranking officials. He was trusted with the lives of presidents and diplomats, trusted to make split-second life-or-death decisions under unimaginable pressure. Yet to a bored patrol cop with a chip on his shoulder, he was just a suspect fitting a description. David pulled the heavy pistol from the safe, checked the chamber out of sheer habit, and slid it into the leather holster he kept wedged between the seats. He grabbed his cold coffee, his keys, and stepped out into the rain. Deadbolts echoed with a heavy metallic finality as David locked the door behind him. He stood in the narrow entryway of his apartment, the only illumination coming from the amber streetlights filtering through the cheap plastic blinds of his living room window. He didn't reach for the light switch. The darkness felt thick, isolating, and entirely necessary. He towed off his damp sneakers, leaving them haphazardly on the welcome mat. The fabric of his hoodie clung to his shoulders, heavy with the ambient moisture of the rain and the sour sweat of his own anxiety. He stripped it off, tossing it onto the arm of a worn grey sofa, and followed it with his t-shirt. The air in the apartment was stagnant. It smelled of old dust, the lingering scent of last night's takeout, and the faint chemical tang of laundry detergent. It was a bachelor's apartment, a transient space devoid of personal touches. There were no photographs on the walls, no plants, no knickknacks. It was a place to sleep, shower, and change clothes before heading back into the high-friction environment of protective details. David walked into the small kitchen, his bare feet slapping softly against the cold linoleum floor. He opened the refrigerator. The interior light flared painfully bright, casting long shadows across the empty shelves. A half-empty carton of orange juice, 2 bottles of generic sparkling water, and a jar of mustard. He grabbed a bottle of water, twisted the plastic cap off, and drained half of it in one continuous swallow. The cold liquid hit his stomach like a stone. He leaned against the kitchen counter, pressing the condensation of the plastic bottle against his forehead. The throbbing ache in his lower back had migrated, creeping up his spine, to settle into a tight, miserable knot at the base of his skull. "Suspicious activity," David muttered into the empty room. The phrase tasted metallic and foul. It was the universal catch-all, the blank check written by the system that allowed men like Foley to manufacture probable cause out of thin air. You're walking too fast. You're walking too slow. You avoided eye contact. You stared too long. You fit a description. He pushed off the counter and walked down the short hallway to the bathroom. He flipped the switch. The vanity lights buzzed to life, harsh and unforgiving. David looked at himself in the mirror. He didn't see Special Agent Carter. He saw a 32-year-old black man with dark bags under bloodshot eyes. He saw the faint, silvery scar on his chin from a bicycle accident when he was 10. He saw the coarse, uneven stubble lining his jaw, the result of a grueling shift where grooming standards took a back seat to sheer endurance. He leaned closer, placing his palms flat on the cold porcelain of the sink. He looked at his own skin. In his line of work, he operated in circles of immense wealth and power. He stood in the corners of oval-shaped rooms and gilded banquet halls wearing tailored wool suits, surrounded by the invisible armor of his agency's prestige. In those rooms, his presence was expected. He was a silent, lethal fixture, judged solely by his vigilance and his capacity for violence in defense of his protectee. But the moment he clocked out, the moment he stripped off the suit and put on a hoodie, the armor evaporated. He became a civilian, subjected to the same brutal, unpredictable lottery as everyone else who looked like him. He turned on the faucet, letting the water run until it was ice cold. He cupped his hands, bringing the water up to splash his face. He rubbed his eyes violently, trying to scrub away the lingering exhaustion and the phantom sensation of Foley's breath on his neck. He grabbed a towel from the rack and pressed it to his face. As he stood there in the quiet bathroom, the adrenaline finally completely crashed. It left him, hollowed out his muscles, trembling with a profound, bone-deep fatigue. He walked into his bedroom and collapsed onto the unmade mattress. He didn't bother getting under the covers. He lay on his back, staring up at the popcorn ceiling, watching the headlights of passing cars throw shifting geometric patterns across the plaster. His phone buzzed again on the nightstand. He ignored it for a minute, hoping the silence would swallow him, but the blinking notification light was a persistent, irritating demand for his attention. He rolled over with a groan and picked it up. It wasn't Kevin this time. It was a message on the secure messaging app used by his division. The sender was Chris, a senior agent on his rotation. Wheels up at 0600 tomorrow. Motorcade route changed. Briefing at 0430. Don't be late. David stared at the glowing green text. It was 3:15 a.m. He had barely an hour before he had to be back on his feet, strapped into Kevlar, wearing an earpiece, projecting an aura of total unflappable control. He had to stand in front of crowds, scan for anomalies, and be ready to take a bullet for a political figure. He barely agreed with all, while pretending the world was an orderly, manageable place. He typed back a single word, copy. He dropped the phone onto the floor. It landed with a dull thud against the carpet. David closed his eyes, listening to the ambient noise of the city. A siren wailed in the distance, a rising, mournful pitch that faded as quickly as it had appeared. Somewhere in the building, a pipe groaned as water rushed through it. He thought about Foley. He wondered if the cop was still sweating. He wondered if Foley was sitting in his cruiser, trying to process how close he had come to ruining his own life, or if he was already spinning a narrative, justifying his actions to his partner, convincing himself that he had been in the right, that David had just been uncooperative. David knew the truth. Foley wouldn't learn a damn thing. Tomorrow night or next week, Foley would see another faded sedan, another dark face behind the wheel, and the cycle would repeat. Only next time the man behind the wheel wouldn't have a badge to stop the machinery from crushing him. The injustice of it was a physical weight on his chest, heavy and suffocating. He wanted to scream. He wanted to break something. But he was too tired. The machinery of his life was already dragging him forward. He had an hour to sleep, an hour to repair the psychological damage of the night, to put the mask back on, and to transform himself back into the Shield. He pulled a pillow over his face, breathing in the scent of cheap detergent and stale air, and waited for the alarm to ring. Sleep proved completely useless. It was a shallow, fragmented state of paralysis, where the low hum of his apartment's heating unit sounded exactly like the idle of a police cruiser. When his phone vibrated against the nightstand at 3:45 a.m., David felt as if he had been chewing on tin foil. His mouth was dry, and the dull ache in his lower back had solidified into a sharp, radiating pain that shot down his left thigh. He rolled out of bed, his bare feet hitting the cold carpet. There was no time to process the lingering nausea from the gas station. The machine was already moving, and he was required to be a perfectly calibrated gear within it. 40 minutes later, David stood in front of his bathroom mirror. The transformation was entirely mechanical. He pulled the custom-fitted Kevlar vest over his undershirt, tightening the Velcro straps at his ribs until it felt like a mild, constant embrace. It trapped his body heat immediately. Over the armor went a crisp, heavily starched white dress shirt. The fabric was stiff, scratching against his neck where Foley's hot breath had been just hours prior. He tied a muted navy silk tie with practiced, thoughtless precision, the knot perfectly symmetrical. Finally, he slid into the dark charcoal wool suit jacket, tailored specifically to hide the bulk of the armor and the heavy steel of the Sig Sauer resting in his hip holster. He pinned the enameled, multicolored lapel pin, the daily identifier that granted him absolute access to the most secure rooms on the planet, through the buttonhole. He stared at his reflection. The exhausted, vulnerable man from pump number 4 was gone. In his place stood Special Agent Carter. The armor was complete. He hated how effective it was. The underground staging garage beneath the federal building smelled of diesel exhaust, damp concrete, and the sharp tang of hot rubber. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead, casting a sickly greenish light over the fleet of black, armored Chevrolet Suburbans. Engines idled, creating a low, vibrating resonance that rattled in David's chest. He walked toward the lead vehicle, carrying a matte black duffel bag containing his encrypted radio's medical kit and spare ammunition. His leather dress shoes clicked sharply against the pavement, a sound of authority that echoed off the concrete pillars. "You look like hell, man," a voice called out. Chris leaned against the rear fender of the Suburban. He was holding 2 paper cups of coffee. Chris was a farm kid from Iowa who had played linebacker at a Division II school before joining the agency. He had blonde hair cropped close to his scalp, a jawline that looked like it was carved from a block of wood, and an easy, uncomplicated confidence that David simultaneously envied and resented. Chris didn't have to think about what he wore off duty. Chris had never been asked to step out of his vehicle for pumping gas at the wrong hour. "Didn't sleep," David said, taking the offered cup. The cardboard was hot, burning his fingertips. Building pipes were banging all night. "You gotta move out of that dump," Chris laughed, taking a sip of his own coffee. "Seriously, with the overtime we're pulling this quarter, you could afford a place with decent plumbing." David nodded, looking down into the black liquid. It smelled infinitely better than the sludge he had bought earlier, but his stomach churned at the thought of drinking it. "Yeah, maybe." Briefing in 5. Chris noted, tapping the heavy face of his tactical watch. "Harrison is already in a mood. Advanced teams screwed up the secondary route, so we're relying on local PD to block the intersections on the fly. He's furious. David's grip tightened on the paper cup. The cardboard buckled slightly under his thumb. Local PD. The words sent a fresh spike of cortisol directly into his bloodstream. He forced his facial muscles to remain entirely slack. He couldn't afford a leak. If Chris saw the crack in the facade, he would ask questions. If Harrison saw it, David would be pulled from the rotation and sent to medical for an evaluation. In this division, any emotional distraction was a liability that could cost a life. Harrison marched out of the elevator bay a moment later. He was a tightly wound, compact man in his late 40s, prematurely grey, with eyes that constantly scanned his environment for threats. He carried a heavy binder tucked under his arm. "Listen up," Harrison barked his voice, cutting through the rumble of the idling V8 engines. The Detail 8 agents in identical charcoal suits gathered around the hood of the Suburban in a loose semicircle. David took his place next to Chris. He set his coffee on the hood, pulled his coiled earpiece from his pocket, and fed the clear plastic tubing up the back of his neck, clipping it to his collar. He pressed the molded earpiece into his left ear canal. The secure radio channel hissed to life, a quiet bed of static that would be his constant companion for the next 14 hours. Protectee wheels up at 06:15. Harrison began flipping the binder open. Motorcade proceeds directly to the downtown convention center. We have a breakfast keynote, a grip and grin with local business leaders, and a closed-door donor meeting. The primary route is burned due to unplanned municipal roadwork. We are taking Route Bravo. Harrison tapped a laminated map. This means we are heavily reliant on the Metropolitan Police Department for rolling blocks. They are stretched thin. That means our perimeter is porous. Keep your heads on a swivel. Carter, you're on the left rear flank today. You have the blind side of the limo when we make the dismount. Copy, David said. His voice was steady. It was the voice of a professional. Any questions? Harrison looked around the circle. No one spoke. Good. Load up. Comms check-in 2 minutes. The agents dispersed. David walked to the rear driver's side door of the follow-up vehicle. He opened the heavy armored door. It swung outward with a thick, resistant weight. He slid into the leather seat, pulling the door shut behind him. The interior of the Suburban was entirely silent, heavily insulated against the outside world. The smell of expensive leather and gun oil filled the cabin. He reached down and touched the steel slide of his weapon through the fabric of his jacket. He was surrounded by the best equipment, the highest level of security, and the absolute authority of the federal government. But as the motorcade rolled out of the concrete bunker and up the ramp into the pre-dawn streets of the city, David felt entirely dangerously naked. Morning arrived not with sunlight, but with a bruised purple haze that hung low over the damp city. The motorcade moved like a massive segmented black snake through the rush-hour traffic. Sirens wailed at the front of the column, clearing a path through the sea of commuters. David sat in the rear of the follow-up vehicle, his eyes fixed on the window. He watched the faces of the people in the cars they passed. Some looked annoyed, gripping their steering wheels in frustration. Some held up their phones, recording the spectacle. Most just looked tired, trapped in their own mundane routines, entirely unaware of the heavily armed men ghosting past them. 2 minutes to destination. The radio crackled in David's ear. It was the lead car. Copy 2 minutes, Harrison replied on the main channel. Prepare for dismount. Standard diamond formation. Let's make it clean. The vehicles slowed as they approached the loading dock of the convention center. It was a cavernous concrete tunnel beneath the main building, illuminated by harsh halogen lamps. The air here was stagnant, smelling of old garbage and commercial floor wax. The motorcade came to a synchronized halt. The heavy doors of the Suburbans popped open in unison. David stepped out onto the concrete. His legs felt stiff, but adrenaline, the clean, professional kind, immediately flushed the fatigue from his muscles. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, granting him clear, unobstructed access to his weapon. He took his position at the left rear of the primary limousine. His eyes began their mechanical sweep. Hands, waistbands, sight lines. He categorized every person in the loading dock within fractions of a second. Caterers, hotel staff, event coordinators, and a line of uniformed city police officers forming the outer perimeter. David's gaze swept over the line of blue uniforms. They were standing at parade rest, enforcing the sterile zone. As the protectee, a towering man with silver hair and a practiced camera-ready smile stepped out of the limousine. The detail tightened around him. "Moving," Harrison called out. The diamond formation glided forward, a synchronized organism of wool suits and coiled violence. David walked backward, at a slight angle, his body positioned between the protectee and the line of local cops. He locked eyes with one of the officers. The man was older, his uniform slightly rumpled his utility belt, heavy with gear. For a microsecond, the cop's eyes darted to David's face. David knew that look. It was the same initial calculation Foley had made under the gas station canopy. It was the subconscious assessment of race, age, and threat. But then the cop's eyes caught the flash of the enameled lapel pin on David's jacket. He saw the coiled wire disappearing behind David's ear. He saw the tailored suit and the rigid, authoritative posture. The transformation was instantaneous. The cop's posture stiffened. He nodded respectfully, dropping his gaze, and took a small step backward to ensure the path was entirely clear. "Morning, sir," the cop murmured as David passed. "Morning," David replied, his voice a low, gravelly hum. He kept walking, keeping his pace matched to the protectee. The irony of the interaction hit him like a physical blow to the sternum. "Sir, just a few hours ago, wearing a hoodie and holding a coffee cup, he was a suspect. He was a target, subjected to the humiliation of a public pat-down and the very real threat of a gun pulled in the dark. Now, wrapped in the expensive tailored armor of the state, he was a superior. He was the authority. It was a sickening realization. The respect wasn't for him. It wasn't for David Carter, the man. It was entirely for the badge, the suit, and the proximity to power. If he stripped the jacket off right now and stood in this concrete tunnel in his undershirt, that same cop would likely demand to see his identification and ask him what business he had being there. They moved out of the loading dock and into the service elevators, the heavy steel doors sliding shut to cut off the noise of the garage. The elevator hummed a smooth, frictionless ascent to the ballroom level. The protectee was chatting amiably with Harrison about the local sports team, his voice echoing loudly in the confined space. David stared straight ahead at the brushed steel doors. The silence in his own head was deafening. He felt a profound, isolating loneliness. He was a phantom, existing in two entirely different realities, yet belonging to neither. He was too black for the world of power he protected, and too insulated by his badge to truly share the vulnerability of the people he went home to. "Approaching ballroom," the advance agent reported over the radio. "Copy," Harrison said. The elevator doors chimed and slid open. The smell of expensive floral arrangements, roasted coffee, and chafing dish eggs flooded the small space. A wall of noise, hundreds of voices, the clinking of silverware, the soft background music washed over them. David stepped out, first clearing the immediate hallway. His hand rested lightly on his stomach, inches from his holster. His eyes darted across the crowd gathered near the ballroom entrance. A waiter dropped a metal serving tray near the buffet line. It hit the marble floor with a sharp, percussive crack that sounded horrifyingly like a small-caliber gunshot. The crowd flinched. Several people gasped. David didn't flinch. His heart rate didn't even spike. His training overrode every human instinct. In a fraction of a second, his eyes snapped to the source of the noise, his hand tightened on the fabric of his jacket, and his body naturally shifted to widen his stance. He analyzed the waiter, the tray, the scattered silverware. Non-threat. "Tray down, Sector 2. We are clear," David murmured into his lapel microphone, his voice deadpan. "Copy clear," Harrison replied. The protectee hadn't even broken his stride, completely trusting the men around him to filter the danger from the noise. The formation moved into the ballroom, swallowing the protectee in the protective ring. David stood his post near the side exit, his back to the wall. He scanned the room, watching the wealthy donors and the politicians shake hands and trade favors. He watched the local police standing by the main doors, keeping the public out. He stood perfectly still, a silent, immaculate sentry. His lower back screamed in protest. His eyes burned from the lack of sleep. But his posture never broke. He was the shield. He was the barrier between the chaos of the world and the insulated reality of the men he protected. But as he watched a local patrolman respectfully tip his hat to a passing donor, David wondered with a dark, bitter certainty who was supposed to protect him from the very people guarding the doors. Applause thundered through the ballroom, a wet, rhythmic slapping of palms that signaled the end of the shift. David maintained his position by the heavy oak doors, his face an unreadable mask of professional detachment. Inside his tailored suit, his body was screaming. Sweat pooled beneath the thick, unyielding plates of his Kevlar vest, itching furiously against his ribs. His left knee, entirely numb for the past 2 hours, now throbbed with a hot, localized pain. The protectee smiled, waved a perfectly manicured hand, and stepped off the podium. "Moving!" Harrison's voice crackled in the earpiece. The organism reassembled. David pushed off the wall, falling seamlessly into the rear flank of the diamond formation. They carved a swift, brutal path through the lingering crowd of donors and local politicians, bypassing the outstretched hands and desperate attempts at eye contact. They hit the service hallway, the heavy doors swinging shut to instantly mute the roar of the ballroom. They descended into the concrete bowels of the convention center. The air grew immediately colder, smelling of diesel fumes and raw cement. The motorcade was waiting engines idling with that familiar, bone-rattling hum. David took his position by the rear door of the follow-up vehicle. The same local cop from earlier, the one who had offered him a deferential nod, was still holding the perimeter. This time, the officer didn't look at David's face. He just stared straight ahead, a soldier doing his job in the presence of federal brass. David felt a bitter, acidic taste in the back of his throat. He pulled the heavy armored door open, slid into the leather seat, and waited for the command to roll out. The ride back to the field office was a blur of grey concrete and intermittent sirens. Nobody spoke in the cabin. The tension that had kept them sharp for the past 8 hours was slowly bleeding out, replaced by a heavy, toxic lethargy. 45 minutes later, David stood in the locker room of the federal building. It smelled of ozone, damp towels and industrial bleach. He unbuttoned his suit jacket, pulling it off his shoulders with a heavy sigh. He draped it over the metal bench. He reached up, tore the earpiece out, and coiled the plastic wire, tossing it into his locker. Then came the gun. He unclipped the holster from his belt, feeling the immediate physical absence of the 3 pounds of steel resting on his hip. He placed it carefully on the top shelf. Finally, the Kevlar. David gripped the heavy Velcro straps at his sides and ripped them forward. The sound was harsh, tearing through the quiet of the locker room. He pulled the vest over his head, wincing as the stiff fabric scraped his ears. The sudden rush of cool, air-conditioned air hitting his sweat-soaked undershirt was euphoric. He dropped the heavy armor onto the bench beside his suit. He took a deep, unrestricted breath, his rib cage expanding fully for the first time since 3:45 a.m. "You look like a corpse, Carter," Chris said, walking down the aisle of lockers. He was already half changed into civilian clothes, khakis, and a quarter-zip sweater. "Feel like one," David muttered. He pulled his damp undershirt off, grabbing a dry, faded grey t-shirt from his locker. He pulled it over his head. "Get some sleep. We're off rotation until Friday." Chris slammed his locker shut, spinning the combination dial. "See you out there?" "Yeah," David replied to the empty aisle. He changed out of his suit pants, pulling on his loose denim jeans and the same frayed sneakers he had worn the night before. He grabbed his worn charcoal hoodie, zipping it up over his chest. He took his badge case, the heavy leather wallet housing his gold star, and slid it into his back right pocket. He looked at himself in the mirror, mounted at the end of the locker bay. The transformation was complete. The armor was gone. The sharp lines of authority had dissolved back into the soft, unremarkable silhouette of a tired man in a hoodie. He was David again. He walked out of the locker room, taking the civilian elevator up to the street-level parking structure. The transition from the sterile, secure environment of the federal building to the chaotic reality of the city streets was jarring. The sky was overcast, a flat, uniform grey that offered no warmth. Traffic honked on the avenue below. David found his battered sedan sitting exactly where he had left it. He unlocked the door, groaning, as he lowered himself into the driver's seat. He opened the center console, pressed his thumb against the biometric scanner of the steel lockbox, and secured his weapon inside. He sat there for a long moment, staring at the dust motes dancing in the dim light filtering through his windshield. He pulled his phone from his pocket. He had one unread message. It was from Kevin, sent an hour ago. "Got an interview. Friday at 10. You think I need to wear a tie?" David stared at the text. He pictured his younger brother trying to navigate a world that was constantly looking for a reason to lock the door in his face. He pictured Kevin standing at a gas pump at 2 a.m, wearing a hoodie, completely unprotected. David hit the call button. It rang twice before Kevin picked up. "Hey," Kevin said, his voice bright, entirely oblivious to the mental wreckage David was currently sitting in. "You off the clock?" "Yeah, just got to the car," David said, leaning his head back against the headrest. "So, the tie, is it too much for an entry-level logistics gig?" "Wear the tie," David said, his voice rough. "Always wear the tie, Kev. Make them see the suit before they see anything else." Kevin laughed, a short, sharp sound. "Right. The armor. Got it. And Kev." David hesitated. He closed his eyes, the memory of Foley's hot, minty breath flashing through his mind. The terrifying, pathetic grey colour of the cop's face when he realised his mistake. "Did you fix that tail light on the Civic? Man, I haven't had time." "Fix it." David interrupted, his tone shifting, hardening into something closer to an order. "Don't drive it tonight. I'll come over tomorrow and we'll change the bulb. Just keep it parked." There was a brief silence on the line. Kevin caught the shift in tone. He always did. "All right, man? Yeah. I'll leave it parked. Everything good." "I'm just tired," David lied. "I'll see you tomorrow." He hung up, tossing the phone onto the passenger seat. David put the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, caught, and settled into its rough, uneven idle. He shifted into gear and pulled out of the parking structure, merging slowly into the thick, creeping traffic of the city. There were no sirens to clear his path, no flashing lights to part the sea of cars. He hit his brakes as a delivery truck cut him off, the red tail lights glaring against his windshield. He was just a man in traffic, existing in the brutal, vulnerable space between shifts. He reached back his fingers, brushing against the rough denim of his back pocket, feeling the hard, rectangular outline of the leather wallet inside. It was there,